I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tips, we're going to be talking about fantasy and sci-fi subgenres. Now you'll notice that I am wearing a costume today. Don't worry, this is typically what I wear to a Renaissance festival. And don't go out in public like this. But I do like it. It makes me feel very pretty. One of the reasons why I thought that this was really important that we talk about is because I think that there is a lot of confusion around the different subgenres. When it comes to fantasy, I see a lot of agents and editors who talk about how much they don't like fantasy, when in fact they do kind of like fantasy, they just don't like certain types. I've created this, I don't want to call it a timeline, almost like a representation of what I think of when I think of fantasy and sci-fi. It's on a spectrum almost. And so what I've done is I've put just the subgenres. You'll notice that not all of them are on there. So if you're a huge, sci-fi or fantasy fan, you might be like, there's a whole bunch missing here. I agree with you, but what I'm doing is I'm creating this kind of idea so that you understand. In the middle is like low fantasy, low sci-fi. At the top is like high fantasy, and at the bottom is what I call hard sci-fi. We're going to talk, and I'm going to start actually really at the top. I just figured we might as well start way up here because most people are actually familiar with high and epic fantasy. They just don't realize it. Epic fantasy usually is a series. It spans many different characters. There's tons of people. There's lots of things to keep track of. There's time, like large chunks of time take place in the story. It can span years. So a really popular one that most people are familiar with at this point is Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is considered epic fantasy. Not necessarily high fantasy because it doesn't have like tons and tons of magic, although that does kind of start to make its way in about halfway through the books and the series if you watch the show. But it is epic fantasy. It's got tons of characters. There's lots of things to keep track of. It spans many years. Epic fantasy. Another series that I like by Margaret Wise and Tracy Hickman is the Deathgate cycle. There's 7 books. There's a lot of history in there. There's a lot of characters that you're following. They recur, they come back. I love this series. And every time I reread it, it's usually been a couple years and I kind of forget some of the stuff that happens in it. So it's kind of nice to return to it. Patrick Rothfuss's The Name of the Wind series, Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, and Shannara Chronicles. One of the things about epic and high fantasy is that, well, any fantasy genre, is that some of them kind of cross over each other. And so you'll have something that's epic fantasy that's also sword and sorcery. So we're going down a little bit to quest fantasy and sword and sorcery. And so in sword and sorcery, you've got to think of like Lord of the Rings, right? You've got swords, you've got fighting, but Lord of the Rings is also kind of an epic fantasy. It doesn't span as much time as like Wheel of Time or Deathgate cycle does. But it's still considered kind of high fantasy because it's in a different world. It's got many different kinds of, creatures and characters. There's magic, there's wizards, all of the things that kind of are involved in epic fantasy. So sword and sorcery, though, I think one of the biggest ones is Conan the Barbarian. Your main hero runs around with a sword and kills things, and that's just kind of who he is. And Eric of Melonbone is very similar. It does kind of the same things. Lord of the Rings kind of meets in there because we do got swords and we got lots of fighting, but it's also epic fantasy. It's also quest fantasy. So we talk about on the other side, we got quest fantasy. Now I see quest fantasy a lot more in young adult and middle grade books. Characters who are given some kind of thing that they need to go find in order to save somebody's life or to save, a kingdom or something like that. There's some show on Netflix right now, the Letter to the King, I think, epic kind of quest fantasy thing. My classic example, of course, is the Black Cauldron series by Lloyd Alexander. That series is very much quest fantasy. You've got your main character, a slightly reluctant hero. He's sent on a quest, and there's things that he has to do along the way. Wizard of Earthsea kind of meets that as well. And I would say anything by Rick Riordan. They are all kind of these quest fantasies, things that they need to collect, or it's almost like a scavenger hunt that they need to go on in order to, meet a certain criteria or to win the favor of someone, whatever it is. And like I said, these kind of overlap a little bit because Wizard of Earthsea also could be considered high fantasy and because it takes place in another world, and also epic fantasy because it also takes place over a long period of time. These kind of top three are the ones that when somebody says they don't like fantasy, I think what they mean is they don't like this epic high fantasy that takes place in a different world. They have a really hard time kind of imagining these worlds, or it feels just too ridiculous to them, and they just can't make that leap into this imaginary world. And that makes sense to me. I understand why that is very difficult for some people. However, that is not all the fantasy there is. As you can see, we've got a lot more to cover. So we're going to jump into the next one, which is something that I think a lot of people are very familiar with, and they also really like, and they just don't like to, and they just don't think of it as fantasy. And that's supernatural and mystery fantasy, or horror. There's so many of these books. So Jim Butcher is an adult kind of a fantasy writer who writes these supernatural mystery stories. He's got these really great characters. There's several different series that he's done, and he's kind of, I don't want to say he's cornered the market, but he's definitely got a handle on this genre. Tanya Huff has written a lot of kind of supernatural fantasies. Anne Rice, her books are considered to be supernatural fantasy. All of the Interview with the Vampire series and the Vampire Lestat. So you are familiar with this genre. Horror also falls into this category, but a little bit. But we're gonna put that down with dark fantasy. So give me a minute, and we'll get to horror. But supernatural fantasy can take place in other worlds. It can have some crossovers. The Tanya Huff Bloodborne series, it is set in our world. It's set in I think it's set in Canada, and the one of the main characters is a vampire from the Renaissance period, and he's just lived to be this old, and so you just kind of follow the stories, and there's a mystery involved, of course, in the series. A lot of people like these stories. We watch them on television. I watch Supernatural all the time, and I've talked about it before. That's supernatural fantasy. We've got angels and demons and stuff. And just because you're more familiar with those things because of popular culture and the religion around us doesn't make it any less fantasy. We've also got fables and fairy tales, which I kind of put along the same thing because it has to do with familiarity. There's a lot of modern fairy tales and fables, but there's also kind of turning things on their head. So for me, a modern fairy tale kind of has been like the Narnia series. We've got talking animals. We've got kind of that fable, fairy tale, Three Little Pigs feeling. And I don't want to equate this to like a little kid's book, but it's got all of the elements that are usually in fairy tales and fables. And then it's been turned into a 7-book series that is epic and quest fantasy and all these other things. There's also within this genre books that are kind of take a fairy tale and turn it on their head. So one of my favorite ones is called Beauty by Sherry Tepper. And in this series, you follow Beauty, who is from Sleeping Beauty, but it turns out that she's not the one who was cursed. Her stepsister, or not her stepsister, her half-sister, because, kings don't necessarily always stick to their own bed. Her stepsister is the one who was cursed, but she was told it was always her. She's actually part fairy and ends up managing to escape the castle when everybody falls asleep because her fairy godmother, who's actually her mother, gave her something that allowed her to be able to survive it. And then it gets like crazy because like she gets picked up by some people in the woods who actually are from the future, and she goes to the future and she meets like all kinds of crazy people there. And it kind of, the author, Sherry Tepper, manages to squeeze in about 10 different fairy tales into one story. And I don't want to give it away, so I'm not going to tell you what happens, as the story goes on, but they're all in there, I promise. Like the shoemaker, the elves and the shoemaker, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White is in there. We've got, the fairy godmother, like all of that stuff is kind of Cinderella, all that stuff. And it's just weaved together in this really wonderful way. Gregory Maguire did Wicked. That is another fairy tale fable story. So we're going to go back over to the other side. So we're going to talk a bit about dark fantasy, which can be kind of supernatural. So that's why they're kind of next to each other. But dark fantasy is more horror. We've got the Neil Gaiman Sandman series. You've got anything by Edgar Allan Poe almost. H.P. Lovecraft, who is very famous for his all of his books. Horror, though, also falls into this category. If you've got It by Stephen King, that's a horror dark fantasy. Carrie is a dark fantasy. They are still fantasy books. Then we've got superhero fiction. Superhero fiction, obviously X-Men and all that stuff, but go with the stuff that has to do with superheroes, like Steelheart series by Brandon Sanderson, about superheroes people who get powers and they're not heroes. It turns out that when people have these powers, they actually become really bad and horrible people. And it is up to the people without powers to stop them. There is also, for kids, Captain Underpants. That's superhero fantasy, or superhero fiction, if you want to call it that, but still fantasy, right? Like, who has superpowers? Nobody. And sometimes the powers come through magic. Sometimes the powers come through science. Doesn't matter. If you get bit by a radioactive spider, you're not going to become Superman. So it's fantasy. So we're going to move down a little bit. So steampunk and alternative worlds, kind of on the same level. It's not quite the same subgenre, especially since steampunk's become such a big thing. So steampunk took me a while to get my head wrapped around, because it's typically set in like a Victorian-esque era. It can go back a little bit to like, Civil War era, or I've even seen some Renaissance ones that are really fascinating. But basically it is usually our world in the Victorian era with some kind of steam-powered or electronic devices that they didn't have at the time. So in Scott Westerfeld's Leviathan series, in World War I, King Ferdinand was not killed. He had a son, and their entire army is powered by these giant steam-powered machines that look like animals. And that's the story. Still fighting World War I, still kind of our world, but we've got this kind of fantastical element of these steam machines. And the reason why I put this kind of lower down in fantasy is, even though this sounds kind of ridiculous, we're starting to get into the not as ridiculous, not as fantasy. This is machines, real machines that are powered by real things. I also think of Cherie Priest, I think that's how you pronounce her name. She wrote the Bone Shaker series, and in that we've got Seattle, where a horrible outbreak has happened, and the whole city has been walled off, and people who have to go in there have to wear these masks and goggles, so very steampunky, in order to fight kind of basically these zombie-like creatures. That one's a little bit more on the fantasy spectrum, right? Rather than on the science, which is the more Leviathan. There's mortal engines. Of course, the very first what's considered steampunk book is The Time Machine, where you have everything is kind of normal, and he's got this one device that he's created that's very different from the time period. Alternative worlds are a little different, because usually what the author has done in these books is they've switched one thing or one element of history. One thing they said, what if the Nazis won? World War II? What if they actually ended up taking over the world? They took over the United States, they took over most of Europe, they took over Russia. What if they won? And that is a book and a TV show series called Man in the High Castle. It is sobering to watch, right? What if they had won? It's fantasy. It didn't happen. So it's an alternative world. But it's almost like this idea of multiverses. So there's this hypothesis that we live in a world of multiverses, and anytime any huge decisions are made, our universe splits. And so now there is two things that happen. So there was something that happened in World War II that caused us to split and for the Germans to win, and for our current universe, that didn't happen. So authors like to play around with this, and it's a lot of fun. Brandon Sanderson, again, wrote a series called The Arithmetist. In that one, the United States is actually a series of islands, and there's magic. It's a certain kind of magic that has to do with chalk drawings. It's really interesting, more on the fantasy element side, right? As opposed to Man in the High Castle, which is all, almost like contemporary fiction. There's no fantasy in it. It's just, what if this had happened? Other books that do this, Harry Potter is considered alternative world because there is stuff that's happening at the same time as our world, and we're just not seeing it, supposedly. His Dark Materials actually talks about there being a separate world, and we know about it. Sabriel's the same way. There's like a wall that separates our world from their magical world, and when you cross over, magic doesn't cross over. Wizard of Oz kind of does the same thing. And then you've got what I was talking about with these alternative histories. Harry Turtledove is the master of alternative history, and he's written tons of these books. This one is one that also kind of taps his toes in historical fiction, because historical fiction, as we talked about in my previous video, is, history with a fictional character mixed in, and you have to be really careful because you want to be as historically accurate as possible. When it comes to alternative worlds, though, you don't have to do that as much. You still want to do your research. Obviously, Leviathan is full of tons of historical facts and details, but it's also completely fictional, and it's an alternative world. So you have to keep those things in mind. And if you feel like your book is kind of going away, or you're trying to take a lot of liberties with history, maybe you're trying to write an alternative history book, and I wouldn't shy away from doing that. So now we're going to move down to magical realism. All right. And this is where I am going to call out some of the agents and editors. So one of the things that I experienced a lot when I was in my MFA program, when I was writing query letters, when I was trying to find an agent, was so many agents and editors who said that they didn't like fantasy. Or they'd say, I want urban fantasy. I like urban fantasy. Okay. Which to me read as, I kind of like Harry Potter and I want another Harry Potter book. So, if you want to send me something like that, I'd be happy to, but please don't send me Lord of the Rings, which is legit. At the same time, though, there are so many things that fall into this category of urban fantasy that it is it's kind of ridiculous. So a lot of things are this magical realism, urban fantasy kind of thing. So I talked about, Love in the Time of Cholera is a magical realism. There's just a tiny hint of magic in there. It's our world. It seems all normal. And yet there's this little thing, a superpower, or somebody has something that just makes it just a little bit different. And it changes the story. The Green Mile is a perfect example of magical realism. Chocolat, with this idea that the chocolate almost has magical properties that change the way that the people in the town kind of function. There are tons of these books that have these just a little bit, and I think that's what these agents and editors are saying that they want. They want just those books that have that just a little bit of hint, because it's kind of fun to have everything seem normal and then it's just this tiny little bit. Typically, magical realism and urban fantasy kind of get lumped together. For me, urban fantasy is books that take place in our world, and seem very similar. So to me, Harry Potter is urban fantasy. It takes place in our world. You recognize everything. The books are kind of bookended with him being, going back home and starting off at home. And then there's this fantastical element that happens in between. But I understand that for most people, when they say that they like urban fantasy, what they actually mean is what I was saying, this very, very little bit of magic that barely exists, or just this one little element. I've talked about Jumper before. The character has the ability to teleport. That would be magical realism, and yet at the same time, it also falls into another category, which we'll talk about a little further down. So then we go into low fantasy. And low fantasy there's very little magic. Like nobody's casting spells. Nobody's, it's not a fairy tale. There's no alternative worlds. It's all happening in our world. And yet there's this little element. So the borrowers or the borrowers are actually considered to be low fantasy. There's no magic. Even though we know that these little people probably are kind of magical, they're presented as just another species that lives on our planet. And they do this little thing, and this is how they've learned how to survive. So there's no actual magical elements in it. They don't have any superpowers, and very simple. Tuck Everlasting, they drank from a fountain that allowed them to live a long time, but they can't do anything extraordinary with their powers. There's nothing particularly special about them other than they just found this well or this spring. Carry On by Rainbow Rowell, also very low fantasy. And I'm putting in here Secret Garden because Secret Garden has this concept in it that the garden is somehow magical. And we know that it's not really. It's almost like the power of nature. But yet it also has that fantastical fantasy feeling in it, and which is meant to have, but that would be considered low fantasy as well. Now, to me, this is the bottom of fantasy, and then we move into what I consider a separate subgenre of sci-fi. And I know not everybody thinks of it that way. Some people, all of this kind of just blends together. This is all fantasy to them. To me, they're very separate genres, but we're going to talk about that. I think the first level that most of us are familiar with is dystopian sci-fi. Usually takes place in the future, typically our world. There's no magic involved or very little magic. It's just our world where something socially has gone wrong, really, really wrong. So Hunger Games, there was a revolt. They split everybody up. They subjugated their people and then forced them to fight every year in order to show them that they were boss. That's pretty awful. Divergent, creating a society that lives with these kind of different factions. Nothing fantastical about it. Nobody has any superpowers. Just, it is what it is. Maze Runner feels a little bit more fantasy, even though it's not really. It's all very science-y. All the creatures in it and all the people who are sick are all from like having an illness. City of Ember also kind of has that fantasy element, but again, science. They're underground. They've been there for 200 years, and they were there to be safe and protected. So our world in the future, something's off. It's not necessarily wrong. We've got this dystopian sci-fi. In the future, no fantasy, or at least no magic. Now, there is futuristic fantasy. And that one is one that a lot of us are familiar with because Star Wars kind of, falls in that category. I know that the beginning says a long time ago in a galaxy far away. I get it. It's still considered futuristic fantasy. Books like this, like Shannara Chronicles, is our world 500 years in the future where elves have come back into the world. Some of them don't even believe in magic. Like they've just come back, but they don't have magic. And they're running into the ruins of humans and stuff, and human society has kind of fallen, and we've got this new world. So it's kind of fantasy and kind of fits high fantasy because we've got elves and we've got swords and sorcery and all that, and there is magic, but but at the same time, it's in the future. So that's also the thing with the Deathgate cycle. I mentioned that earlier in the epic fantasy. Deathgate cycle also takes place in the future, where the world has been split apart by magic. The earth has been split apart and separated into 4 different realms. And you can travel through space back and forth, but your spaceships are usually covered in magical runes. So this weird, cool mixture of sci-fi and fantasy together. So those kind of all fall into this futuristic fantasy genre. And then we move down and we start going into what is considered actual science fantasy. So science fantasy is basing a futuristic world off of loose science. So books that fall into this category would be Ringworld series by Larry Niven. You know, we've got worlds that literally rotate in order to keep gravity, and people live on these rings. It's really a neat concept, and to me, this is very science fiction-y, right? Ben Bova wrote the Orion Chronicles, where you can create a clone who can move back and forth in time, because they've also invented, time travel. Dayworld, if you've ever read Farmer's Dayworld series, and here's an interesting concept, they can freeze people. So like what do they call it? They call it stoning them, which I know sounds like they're high, but they basically freeze people in cryosleep, and you live 1 day a week. So my house would be shared with 6 other families, and I'd be like a Tuesday person or a Wednesday person, and I'd only live on Tuesdays. And this way, they're fixing the population control problem, and so houses are shared by several families, and there's a separate room where everybody's frozen, and you can go look at the faces of the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday people, but you only live 1 day a week. And one of the characters has figured out how to live 7 days a week by kind of almost having split personality disorder. Really interesting. Obviously, that kind of science doesn't exist, so it's kind of fantasy, and so this is why it's like science fantasy. Like there's no way that we could do that, and yet they're kind of playing around with the current science that exists, and also projecting forward into the future. The next genre is, and we're kind of getting into my favorite type of sci-fi, which is hard sci-fi. Hard sci-fi tries as much as possible to use real science to tell stories, or possible science, so it's not so fantastical. Yeah, this technology could exist in the future, and what would it look like if it did? The Martian is a very good example. Will we eventually have astronauts on Mars? It's probable. And what would happen if you did? And what would happen if one of those was left behind? How would we get there? How would we travel to rescue them? How would we get off? How would he survive? And all of that is rooted deeply in science, and the science that we have now. Starship Troopers kind of does that. Ready Player One, which has gained some fame. Andromeda Strain has also done that. Taking what we have now, projecting forward a little bit, so we've got kind of this futuristic element, but also trying to root it as strongly as possible in science. And this is a very difficult genre, I think, to write. It requires a lot of research. Just like with historical fiction, if you're going to write hard sci-fi, you need to know your stuff, and you need to know maths and science. Which is why some of the better books that have been written by mathematicians and scientists, or at least they've gotten some really good help with those books. And then we move into what I consider the final one, which would be epic sci-fi. So just like epic fantasy, big worlds, lots of characters, lots of things going on. It spans years, it spans generations. Of course, the most popular and hugely successful one is Dune. If you haven't read them, or they scared you because they were so thick, I don't blame you. These books are big, and they do span years and many characters, and there's a lot going on. There's words that don't make sense, and it does fall also into the futuristic fantasy genre, but because it's so big and it's a big series, and the fourth book skips ahead like 1,000 years, so I mean, there's a lot that happens in this series. That's why it ends up in the epic sci-fi section of, at least on my list. Dan Simmons' HYPERION series would definitely be considered epic sci-fi. Saga of Seven Sons, Ender's Game. I think all of those kind of fall into that category. These big sci-fi worlds with a lot happening. I love epic sci-fi. I don't want to read it all the time. It can be exhausting keeping track of all these characters, but I love returning to these worlds over and over, and I adore the complexity of them, and so I don't shy away from them, and I don't actually shy away from any of these genres. To me, all of these are worthy subgenres to write in. So that's where you're probably asking, well, why are we going over all of this? I know some of these things. Well, first of all, I think it's really important that you know what you have. I think that authors sometimes will be writing books and they'll say, well, I'm writing a historical fiction book, but it's our world, but it's the future. You're writing an alternative fiction story or to alternative history. And you need to know what it is that you're writing, because you're eventually, if you're planning on getting it traditionally published, you're going to have to send out query letters and you're going to have to tell them what genre you have. If you don't know what genre you're writing in, subgenre counts, then you're showing the editors and agents that you are not aware of what you have and that you're not aware of these subgenres that exist out there. It's okay if you don't know, you don't want to like make a laundry list. You don't want to be like, my book is a steampunk, alternative world, futuristic fantasy, like going through the list. But just knowing what you have really helps. I've talked in a previous video about an author who had written this really wonderfully creepy story. And then when we asked them to kind of add the creep factor up a little bit halfway through the book, because he kind of lost it, he added witches, and we were like, no, witches don't mean creepy, like witches, that's fairies and fables, fairy tales, not supernatural. We want supernatural creepy, So knowing what these different subgenres are is really important. I also think that it's important, if you're an agent or an editor, not telling people that you hate fantasy unless you really, really do. I was sitting in a lecture with a agent who was like, send me your stuff. If you got something, send me your stuff. And she wrote her email address down. We were like, oh yeah, everybody's getting excited. And then she goes, except for fantasy. I don't like fantasy. And it just felt like a deflate. Like you're like, oh, really? But what if I wrote, low fantasy or magical realism? Any fantasy? Like no fantasy whatsoever? Like she doesn't read any fantasy? And it made me really sad. And then I went and Googled her and realized that actually she does publish fantasy. She doesn't know what these different subgenres are. She was saying she didn't like fantasy, but that wasn't true. She did. She just didn't like high fantasy, and that's what she meant. And I think that's really important. I think it's also really important for authors when they're looking for agents and editors to know what an agent means or an editor means when they say that they don't like fantasy. Look at the stuff that they've published. Look at the books that they have edited, and you'll see, okay, actually, what they mean is they don't like blank, and fill in the blank. They don't like quest fantasies. They're over it. Or, they really just don't like sci-fi, hard epic sci-fi. They're not interested in the next Dune, but they'd be happy with the next dystopian book. Or maybe they're over dystopian now, but if you wrote something like this, like Star Wars, kind of in the future, has some magical elements, they might be okay with that. So you got to kind of do a little bit of research here. And we will talk in the future about agents and editors and stuff like that. But I think that this is an important concept. I also want to remove, and I think this is the most important part of this video, I want to remove some of the biases that people have created around these genres. This is a huge selling genre, sci-fi and fantasy. It just is. It's one of the largest sections in a bookstore. It's one of the it takes up so many books in intermediate and young adult books. There's tons of supernatural fiction, tons of fantasy stories in middle grade. I mean, frankly, A Talking Mouse, Ralph and the Motorcycle, is a fantasy story, and it's one of the most beloved stories out there. So let us not have these ideas that just because you don't like epic sci-fi or epic fantasy, just because Lord of the Rings isn't your thing, that doesn't mean that you don't like fantasy. It just means you don't like that fantasy. You're more interested in something a little bit more hyper realistic. And so hopefully, if you're watching this and you kind of started the video with, I'm not a fantasy fan, or I don't really like sci-fi, maybe you're just somewhere in the middle, and that's okay too. And maybe you can stop telling everybody you don't like sci-fi and fantasy, and you can actually use these terms and say, well, I don't actually like sword and sorcery fantasy, or I'm really into dystopian, I just can't get enough of it. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos almost every Friday. I've been Venus with Galaxy Inc. I hope your writing is out of this world.